Shattered glass cut his skin as the buildings ahead collapsed, dropping rubble into the trembling street. Sean covered his face, seeing the dust bellow around him. Only now did the sounds kick into life and deafen the panic. Too little, too late. Where was the 5-minute warning? He stepped backwards, creating distance from the debris. A few of the lamps still glowed, revealing how little of the high street now remained. Screaming cut through the air from people needing help, struggling to be heard against the blaring sirens that echoed into the night sky. Beneath the collapsed building, Sean spotted the remains of people who were only a moment ago had been walking in front of him. Bodies scattered across the street, with those who were well enough now running towards the town shelter, giving little thought to anyone else. The night sky began to illuminate in yellows and reds, the silhouettes of planes lighting up in passing gunfire and explosions. For a moment he thought it looked beautiful, with the vibrant colours against the dark sky. Sean blinked, feeling himself in a daze, and looked back down again, facing the chaos that surrounded him. He shook himself out of the trance and focused. His family would be heading for the shelter. Something loud rumbled through the ground, making his spine shiver. His left arm started to feel sore, making him lift it towards the nearest light. A glint from a large shard of glass caught his attention. It was 2 inches across and looked deeply set in his forearm. Pain began to erupt upon seeing the injury, an ache spreading down through it and making his arm feel heavy. Sean winced, now trying to ignore it. He felt it was better to leave the glass in until he could find a doctor. He turned to face behind and began to run in the direction of the shelter, alongside several others. The shelter usually closed after the 5-minute warning, but if they had been given no warning, then surely the place would remain open for a little while after the attack. An explosion ripped through another building off in the distance, setting off a handful of smaller eruptions after it. Sean halted for a moment, the thought of checking home forcing its way into his mind. He lived only a handful of minutes past the shelter, and to pass the shelter without checking would have been a mistake. Someone shunted past him, pushing him down onto the ground. Sean let out a hoarse shriek, landing on his cut arm and feeling the glass push deeper. His eyes watered as he lay for a moment, his mind fogged with pain. Sean pushed himself up, cradling his arm that was covered in blood. Sean began to run again, but with each step the hard concrete under his feet vibrated his injury, renewing the pain. He stopped and gritted his teeth for a second. The shelter was only a minute away. He began to move at a slower pace, softening his steps in an attempt to minimize the pain, the wet warmth of blood now seeping into his shirt. The shelter came into view, with crowds of people moving down the steps towards the entrance. Another loud explosion was heard nearby, lighting up the sky. Sean sped up, moving faster and ignoring the headache that blistered across his forehead. Shelter was just ahead now, and only down a few steps. He reached the top of the stairs, pushing through the crowd of people. At the bottom he could see the door being closed as people screamed and rushed against it. He forced his way through, some people avoiding him quickly with his blood-stained top. Just as he reached the door, it closed completely with a clunk. At once, the crowd dispersed around him, spreading up the stairs and back across the streets in a flurry to find somewhere else to hide. Sean slumped against the door, hearing the loud scream of the plane above. He felt dizzy, the blood still escaping through his arm. The sound of another explosion came from the direction of his home. "Please," he shouted. "I need to know if my family is safe." He felt tears begin to fill his eyes.